Welcome to the Market Me podcast with your host, Mike Mall. Each episode of Market Me deconstructs real campaigns for actual businesses to improve their marketing efforts. Mike is the founder of Social Media House and a digital marketing consultant who teaches marketing strategy to executives and their teams from small business to Fortune 500 companies. Let's get started.
On this episode of Market Me, we are speaking with Matt Johnson, fellow agency owner and author of MicroFamous. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Mike. Pumped to be here.
Yeah, so we share a love of creating media and podcasting. So why don't you talk a little bit about the book and what you guys do as a company?
So briefly, we produce and launch podcasts for thought leaders, so coaches, consultants, and speakers, and got into that just by doing it myself. I launched a podcast in 2015 in the real estate space and really loved it, enjoyed it. I have a co-host in that space, so the show is a lot of fun to do, got really great results. We're at 1.5 million downloads and counting, and just in the process of doing that, I think probably a lot of agency owners can relate to this. You just start doing something and it gets attention, and then people go, well, how can I do that? And okay, well, that sounds like way too much work. How can you do that for me? And then that pulls you into essentially starting an agency, which is how I got into it. So what I figured out along the way is that it wasn't people in the real estate space that were my ideal clients. It was the fact that they were business coaches, consultants, and really thought leaders. They ended up being my friends and the people that I wanted to spend my time with. So over time, I just shifted to serve them. That's what led to writing the book, which is my experiences with working with those types of folks, building their personal brand, and at one point being a partner in multiple different coaching consulting businesses and watching podcasting being the most effective form of marketing we could do for them, and then just getting better at figuring out why certain podcasts worked and which ones didn't. That's what led to kind of the insights that are in the book. So that's my journey.
Got it. And when did you publish the book? Is it fairly recent?
February 2020, like literally right before all hell broke loose.
Well, I mean, I think one of the nice things is with how much podcasts are growing in popularity and in viewership or listenership, I should say. Now, in my opinion, now is one of the better times than ever to kind of dive in. I hear some arguments sometimes, people saying, "Oh, well, there's so many of them now," and my instinct is just there's not there's not as many as you think. And I think people's natural tendency is to say, oh, well, there's already so much of X, so I'm not going to do it. What's your thought on that?
Well, if they're talking about launching a very general podcast where you interview entrepreneurs, they might be right. I mean, it's fairly well saturated. If you talk to like I was talking to a fellow podcast host who knows John Lee Dumas behind the scenes, and JLD has transitioned their show in a lot of ways. They're going 3 days a week instead of 7. I think they're seeing the writing on the wall. So yeah, I mean, the idea that you're going to launch a podcast with very, very unfocused, general, long form interviews, and that you'll be the next Joe Rogan, I think that's slim to none. But there is still a huge opportunity, I think, for very niched down podcasts that are really specific on who you're trying to reach and what you're giving them, to the point where you can instantly look at the podcast and know what you're going to get out of it. And that's not easy to do. I mean, that's part of what we do for the strategy. And I know it's what you do for clients on your agency side with ads, is like, that's the work. That's the hard part. So yeah, there's always plenty of opportunity. You just got to find it by spotting that gap in the market. So when somebody comes in, one of the best questions I can ask them, and one of the things that people can think about right now, is just, for your ideal client, what's the podcast they're looking for right now and can't find? Yeah, I love that question.
Yeah, and I think usually the majority of the time it's going to be somebody that could answer it, because they're probably the person looking for that thing anyway.
Yeah, it's always better when you scratch your own itch.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I call it, and I think this is from something that Gary Vee said, but kind of the idea of hosting the party. And I've always loved that terminology, because people will often ask, well, why do it? And to me, not only can you create content and build awareness for your brand, and you may become addicted to it like I did, but the other thing is getting access to people and having the ability to communicate with people that usually you couldn't get the time from or couldn't get meetings from. So I think it's an amazing medium. So how would somebody kind of go about thinking through this process, figuring out what their customers need a podcast about now? Do you have any kind of like exercise or any kind of steps that people can follow to think about that?
Yeah, I think the first thing to think through is, do you need a teaching podcast or a networking podcast? Because to me, those are two different things. So Tim Ferriss is a great example. Tim Ferriss has more of a networking podcast. People show up there for the guests that Tim interviews, right? It's not just the Tim show, right? If you want to know what Tim's viewpoint is, buy his books, but he doesn't run the podcast to just preach the Tim Ferriss way of life to you. Mm-hmm. Now, me personally, I would love to see him do that. I would love to see a separate podcast where it's just Tim, because I like his point of view, and I think there's a lot of people that do. But overall, he runs what I would call a networking podcast. And if you look at your business and you say, look, the only thing that prevents me from being more successful is that I don't have enough of the right strategic referral partners, or I don't have a good enough way to kick down the doors and get the right people on the phone, start a networking podcast like right now, yesterday. In terms of practical steps, if you can't do the full podcast launch, one of my friends in the industry, before he started a podcast, he just did a behind the scenes Zoom networking call that had like a small private invite only list. That's a great way to get started. You can also do Facebook Lives, YouTube Lives, like whatever, just flip the camera on and start broadcasting. So there's some really, really actionable, practical things that you can do to get started. And one of the advantages of doing that is you test the idea. That's I'm sure you've seen it, man. There's a lot of people that put a lot of time and thought into something that they've never asked a single person if they actually want, which sounds terrible, but we do it all the time.
Yep. I'm guilty. I'm guilty.
No, me too.
But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, starting to put any kind of content into the market, I think even when I started, before I really started like getting really active with content, I was always of the opinion, okay, this blog post has to be the finished product. It has to be the right thing. And then I would keep adding to it. Oh, well, if we're going to talk about this, we have to explain how that works. Oh, if we're going to explain how that works, we have to tie it back to this other thing. And then you would end up with these like 10,000 word monstrosities. Thinking, I'm not going to put that out. So,
well, how'd you overcome that proclivity? Just like set like a limit for yourself, or do you just like a time limit and just like when it's done, it's done?
I actually just never published a blog because it was always just that I sucked at writing. But what I did is I started solving people's problems online. That's how this podcast started, where I would basically have people on who didn't know that much about marketing, and I would treat it as if it were a strategy session. Like, bring every question you have about marketing your business. I will tell you all the answers. You'll get the information for free, and I'll get the content. So that was my scratching of an itch, where I'm like, I really want to showcase my knowledge and my skill set, but going and trying to dive into these topics without anyone to like conversate or bounce, it kind of ended up in this big stream of consciousness at one point. I mean, it was just unlimited amounts of crap. And so I started just talking to people and solving their direct problems so that I couldn't overthink it.
Yeah, and that's an interesting niche strategy. I don't know of a lot of people that have made that work successfully, because the tough part is the audience. What's the audience listening to? They're getting to eavesdrop in on a strategy call, and sometimes their questions are the same questions the audience has. But yeah, I've had coaches that came and wanted to do that, and from the perspective of like, my team books the guests, so we have the conversations with the guests to get them onto the show. And it's tough to book for shows like that. If you have people coming in already that you're in contact with, if they're going, I just want to pick your brain for a while, and you have a podcast where you can do that on, it makes sense. But yeah, going out and like proactively finding guests and pitching them that it's a strategy session where they show up and ask the host questions, they're like, I don't know what to add. It sounds great. Especially for business coaches, like it sounds like it would be gangbusters because you essentially give away free coaching. But the problem is the person who's being booked as the guest doesn't necessarily see it that way. Yeah. And so it depends on where you're getting your guests from and if you have a good steady stream. But if you have a steady stream of it, that can work phenomenally well because it gets all that stuff that's trapped in your head out in a format where it's like a really natural, easy flow for you as the host.
Yeah. And to be honest, I shifted away from it a little bit. I got tired of hearing myself talk all the time. So I just moved past.
That makes sense. So worked for a while and then it kind of, moved away from it. Yeah, that makes sense.
So tell me a little bit more about the book. I mean, obviously it seems to have come out of your experiences and kind of just meshing together how people think. What can people find in it? What's gonna come in it?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to understand is that the book came from me breaking my own brain. because I was running at one point 2 podcasts in the same industry. One had like a mainstream audience in that space and got all the accolades and hit the best of lists and got shout outs from all the top people and put us on stage and yada, yada. The other one was hosted by a super high level person in that industry that had a really unique story, and he was a consultant and he had unbelievable unique content. So when he and I co-hosted that podcast, and I was an equity partner in the consulting business behind it. The smaller podcast that didn't get all the downloads and didn't get all the accolades did generate multiple 6 figures in revenue a year. So I'm looking at that going, okay, one podcast, a lot harder to monetize. The other podcast, super easy to monetize. What's the difference? Well, the difference was that the podcast that was easier to monetize went straight to an affluent, narrowly focused audience of people that had a big pain and had the money to solve it. And my co-host and I had the content that we could put in front of them that would solve that problem. I mean, he had this amazing story building a 7-figure business that he runs in about 2 hours a week. And so for an audience of people who are making really good money, but working 80 hours a week and feel like they never see their wife and kids, that was a perfect promise for them. I can solve that problem for you, and all you need to do is come to my workshop. And people lined up to pay $3,000 to do just that. And then after that, they would buy the coaching, and he ended up building a 6-figure business off of it. So I looked at that and went, okay, well, what's the secret to that? So I just broke it down and started to analyze what was working for him, the things that were common to him and my other clients, and then comparing that to, as you can see behind me, all the wonderful marketing books and stuff that I'm sure you've read, and really just breaking down how do you take those and put them into a set of, I would say, strategic principles that apply to any coach or consultant versus the stuff that was unique about that situation. And so I extracted the stuff that's universal that everybody can learn from, and that became the foundation of the book.
Amazing. Very cool. And was it a self-publish?
Yeah, the book, self-published. Yeah, it's I didn't even pit like I you know what, there was a really good book that I ran across. Have you ever you ever heard of the book Work the System by Sam Carpenter?
No.
Really, really amazing book for anyone that runs like an agency or a service business. But he made a reference in that book about how that he didn't even pitch a traditional publisher until his 3rd version of the book. Like he looked at his book as a system that needed to be optimized. I'm like, oh man, that is perfect. So I didn't pursue traditional publishing because I'm not going to pursue it until I'm on the 2nd or 3rd version.
Right. That makes a ton of sense. I'll link that book up in the show notes. I'll probably get the audio book of it. I suck at reading and writing, so I like to listen and talk instead. So now if I'm listening, I'm thinking, okay, I like the idea of getting access. I like the idea that people hearing this may, leverage this content to trust me more, to maybe decide to make a purchase with me. How does one get started from the strategy standpoint in terms of, how do I wrap my head around what this is going to be, how this podcast is going to go?
Well, when you look at the podcast landscape, it's really important to understand what's kind of going on out there so that you can realize what the challenge actually is. The challenge is not to look inside and think necessarily about just the personal branding of it, although that can be important at a later stage. The first step is to see where the gap in the market is. And that starts by asking yourself the question of, what are my ideal clients looking for that they can't find, right? So if my ideal clients are out there and they're listening to podcasts, what are they listening to, number one? And what are the episodes where they, they kind of sift out everything else and they go, ooh, I want to listen to that one. What's that episode? And watch what your ideal clients, if you're following them on social media, which you should be, watch what they're sharing, watch what episodes they're saying they listen to, and watch what they post about on social media. And then also pay attention to the people that are in your world and in your email list. And are they asking you to start a podcast? Because if not, maybe a better place to start would be to actually just go out and get featured as a guest first before you even look at launching a podcast. We talked about this before we hit record. Just that like now is such an interesting time and people are wary of making long-term commitments. And that includes to a service like yours and mine that we both sell. So I think the best and most practical place for people to start and to get a sense of what the reaction in the market will be to your expertise and your point of view is to go out there and share it on a podcast interview first and see, what kind of response do you get from the hosts? Do people that listen to that podcast then go follow you on social media or get into your email list? Do they follow up and are they asking you like, hey, do you have a podcast that I can listen to? And those are all indications. And until you start getting that feedback from the market of, oh, I've got something, then I wouldn't worry so much about launching a podcast right now until you have that. And I think being a guest on a podcast is a lot better, faster way to kind of iterate your way to that message, because you really don't know just by looking internally. You might find a message that resonates with you, and then find out that it doesn't resonate with the market. Yeah. And that's one of the biggest things to avoid in podcasting. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes is we lose the battle for podcast growth before we ever launch our show, because we launch a show that we're excited about and nobody else cares.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And so I actually published some content recently about getting on other shows. And I know there's, does your company offer that as a service, like booking?
Not as a service. So I do it for myself, and I used to do it over the years for a lot of clients, just not as part of our service, but just as a relationship building strategy with other people in the space. Is how I kind of built my network. So I highly, highly, highly recommend reaching out through LinkedIn and use podcasting as the bait and the excuse to just make introductions to people and build your network that way. But no, so the what we do offer is that I created a training product that has all of our strategy tools for coming up with your podcast idea, all of our advice on tech, and a training that you can put an assistant or a team member through so that they learn how to pitch you. Because I for the most part, unless I run into somebody personally through a LinkedIn connection, I don't go out and try to pitch myself. Right. Either I just have conversations that turn into bookings, or I have my team reach out and look for shows that they think I'll be a good fit for, which is why I'm here. And so, yeah, that's called the MicroFamous Fast Track. You can just go to getmicrofamous.com and get all the links for that. But yes, we don't offer it as a service, but we do have a training, and all my clients get that for free. And I started with that, just giving it to them for free, because I knew that I created it because my clients needed it.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's what we do.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. And so how are you thinking about your own podcast and the way that your company is running into the future? I mean, I think there's unlimited ceiling at this point for this stuff. Mm-hmm. I think people having the desire to listen on demand on the go whenever they want. It's a small download versus a video. It's something that's easy to throw into your pocket and have at all times. And you can see with the investments that Spotify and some of these other companies are making in the future of the medium. Yeah. It's really interesting to watch how much money is getting thrown around, I think, because they're seeing this tide shift. So how are you looking at it?
So the conversations that I'm having behind the scenes with coaches, consultants, speaker, trainer, thought leader types is not only do they love podcasting, but they're typically looking at doubling down, and they're asking themselves, is now the time to launch a second podcast? Which is really interesting, because I don't think this is the right strategy for everyone, but once you get into podcasting and you realize the power of it, you start looking at it going, okay, there's another opportunity here from even more niched down, even more focused podcast where I only talk about this certain thing for this type of person, and I address a very specific need in the market. Yeah. And those types of conversations is where it's leading me to where I've split off my podcast into conversations and then my regular show, which is teaching, right? So I have a networking show and a teaching show. It used to be that everybody just threw it all in together. It was one show. It was named after your brand. It was your catch-all. Like a podcast used to be a catch-all for basically any audio content you created. I think that's another thing that I think those days are over. I think the one thing that needs to catch up is that people have already kind of demonstrated that they want super, super niche content. They want to go to a podcast and they want to know exactly what they're going to get out of it. Great, fine. Where the technology needs to catch up on is the ability to subscribe to multiple podcasts, maybe with one click or something like that. You know what I'm saying? Right. I mean, yes, you can ask people to get into your email list. Yes, you can get them into something else. But what I want from Apple or Spotify is I want the ability to have 5 different podcasts that answer very specific needs in the market. And if somebody likes my point of view, I want them to be able to go bloop and subscribe to all 5 of my shows.
Got it.
And that we don't have yet. When we have that, I think we'll see an explosion of super, super niche podcasts where the same person hosts multiple shows, and then it's game on.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. I've even been thinking it's funny when you're already producing one, and you've got to book the guests, you've got to have the conversations, you have to send it to post-production. Like once that is already in place, there's really nothing stopping you from having 2 or 3. it's really just a little bit more work on each of the three pillars of getting it done, like booking, recording, post. Promotion obviously is a factor, but yeah, I've actually been considering launching a couple other concepts that are just more, like you said, more specific to that target audience. Came up with an idea a little while ago that I tried to give to somebody and they didn't run with it, and so I think I'm gonna do it.
Take it back. Take back your idea.
They wanted me to come in and actually help them launch one, and so I was like, here's like an interesting opening concept for you, because it's like executive recruiting. It's like kind of the perfect thing, but I'm actually going after executives as well for my program. So I was like, there's a whole bunch of stuff that executives don't know a lot about that they feel like they should know. They're probably too embarrassed to ask. Like with all, especially from a technology standpoint, like how many of these, how to Google ads and like all these like nuanced, like little things that they would want to know, but like probably wouldn't ask or even have the time.
So it's like, look good in the boardroom.
Yeah. And so I'm thinking about it like interviewing different experts and saying, hey, explain this to me in like less than 10 minutes as if I were a complete newbie and had no idea. Right. And so like, how do you strip those concepts down to their bare bones so that someone who's busy could spend 10 minutes and be like, oh, now I know what that is. Cool.
Yeah. It's like, it's like stuff you should know, but for executives.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And somebody's done that in the news space. It's a friend of one of my clients. She was a newscaster and wanted to get out of that business. And so she started a podcast that was basically a daily news briefing on less than 10 minutes. And it's just all the stuff you need to know, all the major headlines condensed, kind of stripped of political viewpoints and things, just giving you the facts so that you can literally just listen and in 10 minutes get what we need to know that to keep up with current events. Thousands upon thousands of downloads in less than a year and a half, sponsorships, like the whole 9 yards. Yeah, she just found a little tiny sliver in the market of people that were looking for something that couldn't find it. It's a great idea.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I think that's the future. I think there will always be a place, at least in the coaching consulting space. And I don't know how many of your clients are in that space, but I that's basically all of my friends and clients. Like they're trying to teach and lead people and train people. You know what I'm saying? Like they have a point of view and their service is sold based on people buying into that belief system and buying into them. Like they will always need a place for them to teach, train, and lead, whatever that looks like. Like no matter what latest, greatest podcast tactic is taking off at the moment, they will always need a place where people can go and get to know them better and get to know, okay, what does this person stand for? And do I agree with them? So at the end of the day, whatever might change, I think there's always a place for, 10, 15, 20-minute long teaching segments, whether they're on video or audio or whatever. And whether they live on YouTube and then get distributed as a podcast as an afterthought, or whether they're just a podcast, I think just depends on the person. But at least all the people that I know that are in that side of the business, like the need for that and the demand for it from their people will never go away. So that's why I think is like a solid foundation for podcasting.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. And I agree. I think there's a couple of people that I follow that they take almost like what they would have in their program, but then making it into micro pieces and then maybe having conversations about it or kind of fleshing it out in like long form, which is interesting because when you get into most of these people's content from like you buy into something, it's very polished, right? The online component of what I teach is this very tight, very presented. And I like the idea of kind of taking a deeper dive or a deeper exploration of a topic and maybe like hearing that person walk through the concept or kick it around with somebody else to kind of see their perspective or other avenues or other ways to look at it that you wouldn't get in that finished polished product. So
yeah, I mean, I know like for my podcast, there's examples that I bring up on a podcast episode that don't make it into the book. Because you want something in the book to be evergreen and stand the test of time. So I'll give examples in the podcast that are fleeting or that I just can't come out and say, I'll give way more opinions on Gary Vee and Simon Sinek's point of view in a podcast episode than I would put down in a book. Right. And there's different things like that. So a podcast is a really great opportunity to go deeper on some concepts and then also just to say things in a certain way that you can't put into a polished product like a book or a program. And it gives people some insight into what your belief system is. And that's really what, like if you go back to Simon Sinek, Start With Why, Like that's what determines whether people really want to work with you or not, is do they agree with your belief system? And that's becoming really, really important, especially these days. I mean, people want to know, and it's getting to the point where politics is creeping into it as well, where they kind of want to know where you stand, not just even in a business sense. They want to know where you stand in a sociological, economic way, just to see if they agree with you on that stuff, to see if they want to trust you on the business stuff. Like that's a really interesting dynamic that wasn't there in even 2019. So there's a lot of stuff to watch out for. But either way, podcasting solves all those problems and gives you an outlet for all that content.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I do, and it's funny you said that, because one of the things I do when reaching out on LinkedIn or Instagram is I always send a video, a personalized video, because for me, same idea. They want to like make sure that they agree with you. They want to make sure that the ideas resonate and they're the same. I would rather someone hear me and see me and say, his way that he speaks or the fact that he swears is like either okay or it's off-putting and I don't want to continue. And then we finish the conversation way ahead of maybe getting down the road of them becoming a lead and proposing to them, all that stuff.
And then finding out they don't like the constant sailor-like swearing. Yeah.
I know. I am working on it. Not that much, but I am.
You've been very tame. I'm very surprised at, like, I wouldn't have guessed, but yeah, I guess whatever you say. We'll see what happens when we turn off the recording.
That's right. Well, listen, man, I really appreciate your time. Where can people find you and the company and the book?
Easiest place is getmicrofamous.com, because that's got that new website's coming, but right now it's got all the links to everything. You can also just go to getmicrofamous.com/free and get a free digital copy of the book.
Oh, amazing. Sounds great.
I know not everyone wants to read. So so I've actually got an audio series as well going on the podcast right now that covers all the core key, the key concepts of the book, so that if you're not a big reader, you don't even have to read to get them. So you can check out the podcast as well.
Amazing. I'll be signing up for that side of the equation. Awesome. Well, thanks so much.
Thanks, Mike.